Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books, and in partnership with Northshire Bookstores and Anderson's Bookshop, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Philippa Gregory to discuss her newest novel, Dawnlands, published by our friends at Atria Books. Philippa Gregory is the author of many New York Times best-selling novels, including The Other Boleyn Girl, and is a recognized authority on women's history. Many of her works have been adapted for the screen. She graduated from the University of Sussex and received a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, where she is a regent. She holds honorary degrees from Teesside University and the University of Sussex. She's a fellow of the Universities of Sussex and Cardiff and was awarded the 2016 Harrogate Festival Award for contribution to historical fiction. She's an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck University of London and was awarded a CBE title for services to literature and charity in 2022. Wow. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Silvia, Licha, who worked in newspapers for many years in Puerto Rico and was a political columnist and business editor for El Nuevo Dia, the island's largest daily, until she moved to Miami with her family in 1988. During the 90s, she was the lifestyle editor for El Nuevo Herald, the Miami Herald's sister Spanish paper. Since retiring, she enjoys tutoring, gardening, and of course, reading. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And we thank you for ordering your copy of Dawnlands from Books and Books, Anderson's Bookshop, or Northshire Bookstores, and supporting indie bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Well, hello. Welcome.
Good evening. Hello.
How are you? And it's a great honor. Let me tell you, King Charles may be on his throne in England, but we have with us tonight the queen of the English historical novel, Philippa Gregory. This is a great honor for me. I'm a big fan. I've been reading your books for years, and I'm really enjoying this three. So far, you've written 3 books on Fairmile, which is the story of Alinor and her family and how it develops. I love the fact that these are normal people, but set within the background of always the turmoil of English history and how you put the kings and the like Cromwell, the whole Civil War, the whole thing. But I think it's wonderful the way you have these normal people. Is it more liberating for you to make a character up within a historical framework?
I think it gives you the opportunity as the author to set your imagination free, and because the spread of English history and because particularly the Cromwellian War, the Civil War period and the disruption after that, there's so much happening in England that in a way to have fictional characters who can weave in and out of the extraordinary history, that's very, very exciting. But I always really like to have my fictions rooted in the reality of the time. So there's a sort of a balance between the two. There's the absolute rigid history of the facts, the dates that we know, the events that are very, very clear, the wars that are fought, the defeats that happen. And then there's the fictional lives that are affected by the events.
Yes, exactly. Well, the first one, the Tidelands was the first one. I think it started with the end of Charles I when he was beheaded, right? The king. And then the second one starts when his son comes back, Charles II. And then this one has James VI, and who really doesn't, you don't portray him as a very smart leader.
I mean, I think one of the things that is true of the Stuarts is that they are incredibly incompetent politicians. So Charles I, there was no need for him to go as far as civil war with his people. There was certainly no need for him to stand trial. There was not a great appetite to execute him. He really just misjudged the climate of the times. And the family that I have, the fictional family, are really divided. Some of them, the woman Alinor is very much attracted to a royalist spy, and in a sense on that side, and her brother Ned, who is a Cromwellian soldier, is very much on the parliamentary side. So one of the interesting things, I mean, I know you have it in your own history too, about a divided country, is how it divides families as well. And so the second novel, as you say, is based around the restoration of Charles II. And this novel now is about James II and his wife Mary of Modena, and their attempt to restore to England a Roman Catholic monarchy and a tyrannical monarchy, and the resistance of the people.
Yes, and we all know how that went. That didn't go very well. So anyway, what I also found in my research, looking you up a little bit, you know, the noise that the mill makes in the first book, the awful noise that the mill makes when the water comes in. And I said, oh, what is that? I had never actually heard about that. And then I discovered that you yourself have said that you had a very great fear of loud noises pertaining to water, like a mill race or hydroelectric works or something. And that's one of the things that Alinor has. So did you put that in with that idea?
I don't think I consciously went, I'm afraid of this, I will put it in. There is a tide mill in the location where I set the novel, and there are not many tide mills working in England now, but at the time, most coastal areas had a mill which ran on seawater. So when the tide is high, it fills the mill pond, and when the tide goes down, the miller releases the water through the mill race and turns the wheel. And it is very noisy, and it is, if you are like me, rather scary. A combination of machines and deep water, I do find rather scary, and I don't know why. It's not that I had any experience of that to like make me feel like that. I do find that rather scary, and of course, when you're drawing on your own fears and writing a fiction, you have a sort of a depth and an immediacy of it, which you can't reproduce for anything else.
I guess, yeah, and you made very good use of it, because it was actually a foreboding for her of what would happen eventually to her with the water wheel. Yeah,
it's a very terrifying scene. I'm on book tour now, and someone this evening talking about, I'm on a book tour for book 3, which is 3 years on from the publication of the first book, and someone this evening said that that scene both frightened them and moved them to tears. It's the swimming of a witch in 1640, when the appetite for persecuting women as witches was very, very high in England. It was the peak of the witch scares.
Yes, for women like Alinor, it was always a very dangerous thing to live with being a herbalist and a midwife and that sort of thing.
I think, yes, but also I think it in a sense, it teaches us in the modern world that if you step out of the stereotype of what is accepted for female behavior, you don't just get the criticism for stepping out. People don't just say, oh, she's a great leader. You know, you also get this kind of absolute downrush of prejudice against women, which is often voiced in very, very sexist, very, very abusive, and in the case of the 1640s, physically dangerous accusations.
And I think you have made it a tenet of your life to write about women's lives in history that were often ignored. And I think this comes through in your books, both about common people and about people of the courts that we don't know about.
I didn't. It wasn't an ambition when I started out, except, of course, as a woman, growing up in as a student in the 80s, it was really apparent to me that one of the untold parts of English history was women's history. And that's still true even today. You know, we're making inroads into it, but still all of the history that you read, all of the traditional history that you read prior to 1950 is actually not the national history. It's a history of men.
Mhm.
And I think it's really thrilling that there's a generation of women historians who have been penetrating that and getting the story of women's history published. But I'm also very interested in the stories that are not told, the other stories that are not told. So, for instance, in this novel, Dawnlands, it's named for the tribal name by the Poconoke people of the area they inhabit, which is the east coast of America, of Northeast America. And they call it Dawnlands because it's the first area, they think, in the world to see the sun. They have a sense of the enormous continent of America stretching to the west, and in front of them is the sea and the sun, and they call their country Dawnlands. And it was very thrilling to me to talk of their story and to talk of the story of common people sold into servitude at the same time as talking about women's stories as well.
Yes, you've been able to combine the two continents, especially in this book, with the character of the Indian woman who is so strong, and also the Caribbean. You go there too, Barbados. Being from Puerto Rico, well, you know, I've been to Barbados, so it's a wonderful thing that you've actually incorporated that into the book. Very interesting.
The intention of the whole series is to look at how one English family come from real poverty and a very small locality in England, the south coast of England, and how by getting into trade, which is first of all local and is then international and is then global, that the prosperity of this one family sort of tags onto the back of the expansion of the British Empire, as so many families did. You know, when we look today at what families were involved in slavery and what families were involved in empire. There's a very great English historian called E.J. Hobsbawm, and he says there isn't a family in England that doesn't benefit from empire. And this is a very typical story of a family that start from quite extreme poverty in the 17th century. And by the time we get to the 20th century, they're bourgeoisie, they're, landed bourgeoisie entirely from the progress of the British Empire across the globe.
And the book also has a very interesting character, Livia, of course, the terrible Livia, that I think is a wonderful character because she's so bad. And from what I can see, because there will be a next book, this is not a trilogy, you're planning on going to a fourth book. She will be a very important character in the fourth book. You give a hint.
Absolutely. She's absolutely fundamental in the rise of the family, although she is completely despicable and she's very sexually manipulative and she's incredibly selfish and incredibly ambitious. She's a really, truly terrible mother, but she uses her rather lovely son to further her own ambitions. She's a great character to write, of course, because it's always lovely to write really bad characters, and to write really bad women's characters is a joy. But at the same time, she is really instrumental in moving this family into prosperity, because there are times when her ambitions align with theirs, and she's a very, very effective operator, as such women that, when we know them in real life, very often are. And yes, she'll go into book 4 for sure.
And I read, I think, that you plan on maybe bringing this family into even the early 20th century.
Well, my ambition when I started the series was that we would start in 1640 in a very poor, almost peasant family, and that we would see them grow in prosperity to the sort of the peak of the British Empire round about the turn of the 1900s. But as I have moved along, I have just fallen in love with the characters so much that I can't jump quickly a generation or 2 generations. So all I'm managing to do is each book move down a generation, which means that it's at least 4 books a century, and I started in 1640. So, you know, it's going to take a while to get to basically the sort of the possible conclusion of the series in 1920. I don't even know I'm going to live that long, but certainly I'm going to keep writing in this series while it is such a favorite of readers and while it's such a joy for me.
Well, for me as a reader, that is wonderful news that you're taking slowly the characters to develop them, because I really have enjoyed this series. Of course, I've enjoyed all your books, but because I think you marry the two worlds, you marry the royal and the common people, and your research about their lives is so interesting. You bring in details that you don't find normally even in history books. How do you manage to find those details about common life?
Yeah, I mean, you have to look for them. The thing is that so much of English history has been about men and from the male point of view that historians have not troubled to look for the lives of common women, and then they say, oh well, there's nothing there, there's no material there. There is actually a lot of material about the lives of common women, but it's almost always official reports upon disruption or crime. So you just have to get the mindset that you read these reports in a way that they're not intended. You have to read them as a rebellious woman, not as a rather shocked and disappointed upper class man. So when there's a lot of court reports that say, you know, the women are being surly, you know, and if you think about what that means and what that would have meant at the time, it just means that the working class women are not being subservient. They're not being incredibly deferential, so they're called surly. So you have to read through the elite language and imagine what the working people are doing. If it says they're being disobedient, it means they're perhaps actually rebellious. So there's a lot of reports of, for instance, food riots, which are quintessentially female protest. It's mothers and wives and daughters going like, we cannot pay the price in the market for the food. And then they have a food riot in the market and they pay the price they can afford. And the elite reports of that are always in terms of, it was an uncontrollable riot, it was a mob, it was people overturning the stores and causing all sorts of trouble. But if you read through the fear and the anger of the elite, what you find is often quite an orderly public protest against exaggerated prices. And that's where women's history is. It's in the criminal archives, and it's often not what we would consider as crimes, it's what we would consider as protests.
And of course, your background has made you the perfect person for finding, as you say, reading between the lines, because you are actually a historian with two titles from the University of Sussex and Edinburgh. I also read, it was really astonishing, that while you were getting your degree in the University of Edinburgh, you wrote the first novel, Whiteacre, did you not?
Yes, I did, and I can't really explain it. I also had my first baby.
How did you manage to do? It's
the
crazy.
Well, I was in my early 30s. I was very full of energy. I could literally see what I wanted to do with my PhD thesis, so that was quite rapid and quite clear to me. I've always written fast, so that was really, really helpful. And it just happened. I mean, what can I say? It was something that I was able to do at the same time as having a baby. She was a very helpful baby in that sense that she slept. She had a nice nap in the morning, she had a nice nap in the afternoon, and she slept pretty well at night. So it was possible. And I can't imagine doing it now. You know, when I have grandchildren now and I look at the hours they keep and I go like, how could you do anything except sleep when they sleep? But that in my early 30s, absolutely inspired by my research, absolutely inspired by the novel I wanted to write, it was possible to do 3 things at once.
Wow. So when you were getting your degree, you got it also just that was your plan to become a novelist, or
Oh
were
no.
you? No.
No, I had no intention of being a novelist at all. I wanted to be an academic. I wanted to teach in the university. But when I was completing my degree, my PhD, Margaret Thatcher was running the country, and she put a complete stop on new appointments to universities as part of the money saving austerity drive of a right-wing government that cared nothing for culture or education. And so when I completed my PhD and came to get a post, all the posts were frozen. So in that 6 months, I finished the novel that I'd been writing for fun and sent it off to agents while I really figured out what I would do. I didn't know what I would do for a living. And it happened that that novel was Wideacre, and it was a worldwide success. And after that, I went like, so very, very carelessly, really. I went, oh, well, I'll be a novelist then for a bit.
For a bit.
See how it goes. And like I can report it's gone rather well.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I know. I think I'll stick with it for a bit.
Are you going to stick to the Fairmile people from now on, or do you also? Oh, I think you're doing a book on women's histories, right? That is not a novel.
The next book I'm going to publish will be one on women's history, non-fiction, a huge, huge book, 1066 to 1992. Women's lives, not a list of important women, not about important women or women that you necessarily know about, but literally about the sort of lives women lead in each century all the way through for 9 centuries. It's a huge book. I haven't finished writing it yet. I'm still in the middle of writing, in the middle of research, but I can report that I've got to 1850.
All right.
Which doesn't sound much, but given that I started at 1066, it's a lot. So I've got 1 more century to go, and then I'm ready to send it in to the publishers, and then it'll be published about this time next year.
Well, for Philippa Gregory fans, this is all wonderful news that you're imparting us tonight. So especially the fact that Fairmile will go on for a few books, and then we'll have that magnificent history book to look forward to. So I think that's wonderful. And I want to give our readers a chance and have Christina hop in again to give the people that are with us tonight to also ask you direct questions. But let me tell you, it's been a great honor for me.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to your work.
Okay, so we have a question here from the audience. How much historical research do you typically conduct before writing one of your novels?
Well, the more I write, of course, the more I have, as it were, in the bank. So I have now a huge library of historical books, and I have a huge bank of notes, and I have a huge memory of the material I've read. So it's not that I research for each book, it's that each book informs the next. However, in terms of specific things that I'm going to need for each book, I read for about a year. And then while I'm writing, different things come up. And also I visit the locations. So for Dawnlands, I visited the West Country, which isn't an area that I know very, very well, for the Monmouth Rebellion, which takes place just in the West Country. And the people who are captured in the Monmouth Rebellion are sent in servitude, as you mentioned, to Barbados. And so I went to Barbados also, and went to museums and read histories of Barbados. So each novel produces its own questions, and they have to be answered. And altogether, I suppose, prior to starting writing, it takes me about a year.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll remind everyone who's watching that now, there comes another question. Thank you. Someone would like to know, what is your favorite book that you have written?
I think it's very difficult to pick a favorite because they're very, very different, of course, and they all have particular memories and resonances for me, and some were easier to write than others, and some were more enjoyable to write than others. I think I'm very, very fond of this series at the moment. You're always very fond of the book that you're working on at the moment because it's so alive for you. So I suppose at the moment, my top three favourites would be Tidelands, the first book of the series, Dark Tides, the second, and this one, Dawnlands. But if I was looking back into my past, I think I'm very, very fond still of books like The White Queen and The Other Boleyn Girl, because they were such extraordinary books to launch as well as to write.
Thank you. Did you get to work on the film set for The Other Boleyn Girl?
I partly did. I had the misfortune to fall off my horse during the preparation for The Other Boleyn Girl, and I had quite a severe injury which kept me bedbound for 6 weeks and then recovering for another 6 weeks. But so I was very closely in touch with the writer Peter Morgan, who went on to write The Queen and The Crown. So we would have long conversations on the phone, but I wasn't as present on the set as I have been on other television series or movies. But I visited a couple of times, and I had the chance to see the actors working, and that's always, especially when they're such fine actors, it's incredibly evocative to see your characters come alive.
It must be. Thank you. Someone would like to know, who is your favorite historical woman to research?
Oh, that's quite easy because I'm very, very fond of Jacquetta, Duchess of Bedford, who is the heroine of Lady of the Rivers. She goes on to be, she's regent of France with her first husband when England owned France. And then she goes on to be a very close friend of Margaret of Anjou, who is the Queen of Lancaster in the Cousins' War. And then her daughter is Elizabeth Woodville, who marries Edward IV and who I describe in The White Queen. So she's a woman who is absolutely at the heart of the biggest adventures of the 15th century, and yet she doesn't even have a biography published. There's very, very little known about her, and there's almost no work being done on her, and the only published description of her life I published in my history book, which is called
Yes,
The
you
Women.
did. I happen to have it here.
That's the one.
And I just happen to have it because I'm a big fan of hers, you know. So.
Yes. And it's extraordinary to me that, you know, I like to be able to say to people who are enjoying a novel, yes, if you want to know the real history, there's something that you can read. And in the case of Jacquetta, Duchess of Bedford, there is my essay. And I literally wrote that essay because I have to be able to say to readers, this is the fiction that I wrote based on her, but if you want to know the real history, here it is. So as it is in The Women of the Cousins' War. I'm so glad you have it. Thank you.
And I enjoyed it very much.
Did you also visit the sites in America? If so, how did that inform the series?
It was one of the most important visits that I made. I went, as I always do, every time I'm in Washington, to the History of American Indians in Washington. And then I went to a wonderful museum. And then I had the incredible honor and privilege to meet with the Pocono people of today. They took me to their national lands, Mount Hope outside Boston, and welcomed me to their people. They were so generous with their time and they were so kind. And I would not have written a history of another ethnicity than my own without checking with them, without clearing with them that they wanted their story told in that way. And they were very, very clear that they wanted their story told. And they shared with me their oral history, which they have deliberately not written down, and which they transmit orally, absolutely, so that the narrative is controlled. So what you end up with, and I had never thought of it before, but what you end up with the transmission of oral history is a really pure account. Whereas our history, because anybody can tell it, anybody can publish it, anybody can then read it, and then write their own version, what you end up is all sorts of different versions, some of them completely inaccurate, some of them absolutely biased. But if you have an oral history and you have a people that contain it, what you have is a completely pure narrative which descends through the generations. It was so interesting to me to be invited into that story.
That sounds fascinating. Thank you. Someone would like to know if you were always interested in history as a child. What inspired you to study history?
I can confess that when I was at school, I was a very bad student and I was not interested in history. And I have to say that on the curriculum at that time, my school's history was unbelievably boring. It was a lot of military history and it was a lot of ancient Roman history. And if you had sat down to say, what can we teach young people that will mean that they have no interest in history for the rest of their lives? The Wars of Justinian, I have to say, score very high. So I did very badly at school at history, and I didn't go to university immediately. I went to train as a journalist, and I'm very grateful for that apprenticeship. And then I went to the University of Sussex to read English literature because I was always an obsessive reader, a reader of multiple books at the same time, always. And while I was at university, I met an incredibly inspiring historian, and I realized that history, for me, answers the great questions of life. You know, when everybody, especially I think when you're young, you have a, what is the meaning of life and what are we doing here? And for me, that answer was not a spiritual one, it was a history one. We are here because of what's happened in the past. We are here because of what happened to our parents, and the future will be determined by what we do now.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking. Let me see. Let's do one more question. How many novels do you write at a time?
I was about to say, of course, only one, but actually that's not true. I do write, especially if it's a children's book or something else, something unlike a historical fiction. I can write more than one thing at a time, but mostly, unless it's completely different, like I could write a script or I could write non-fiction, but normally I've just got one big historical fiction going at a time because it's so absorbing, it's so time consuming, and in order to get it right, you have to have such focus, concentration on it every single day. So when I'm writing a historical fiction, I'm doing the historical fiction for most of the day, every day until it's finished.
Can you share a few observations about your craft? You said you were a very fast writer. How many hours a day do you spend writing? Just a few observations about your craft.
I'm glad you call it a craft. I think it is a craft. I think there are times when it takes wing and becomes an art form, but that's not very controllable by me. In a sense, I tackle it as a piece of really beautiful, really thoughtful craft work. And every now and then it runs away with me. And then I know that the muse has descended and the magic is happening. And I long for that, but I don't make it happen. I wait until it does happen. Every day I write for probably about 4 hours in the morning, mostly in the morning, and then I'll take a break, and then in the afternoon I will research or I will reread what I wrote during the day, and then that's probably it for the day in terms of work. Though I might read something lighter later in the day, or I might watch television. But I do notice that if I write for more than 4 hours, I think I genuinely confuse my unconscious that I will then dream in character, or I'll dream in period. And when that happens, I tend to pull back a bit because I think I've literally muddled my brain up and it doesn't know what century we're in. And that's not good for me or my brain. So in terms of writing, probably about 4 hours a day, but also in the writing, it's not starting at the beginning and writing consecutively, chronologically to the end. There's a continual going back over the day before's work, editing, rewriting, improving, and then going again. And there's a lot of cutting and a lot of throwing out.
Thank you. One more question. What advice would you give to aspiring historical fiction novelists?
Apart from, don't tread on my toes. But really, that's okay too. I think you can't write about a period unless you have really embedded in your awareness lots and lots and lots about it, like the weather. So in the period that I'm writing about now, it's just finishing what's known as the Little Ice Age. So there's no point looking at England today and going, just take out the roads and the railways and it's like that. It's not like that. It's much, much colder. It's much, much poorer, and it's much more on the edge of hunger all the time. So you have to really, really know your period. Don't shortchange yourself by thinking you can read one history book and go like, it's like that. The other thing is that the incredible unreliability of history books. So you can't read just one. You've got to read about 20 because you will get 20 different versions and 20 different opinions. And that is how you find your opinion and your version of what's happening. So you have to really, really embed yourself in the period in a very serious way, that you can't write a good historical fiction if you're having to look stuff up all the time. It's got to come from what you have learned and what you genuinely know and what you can remember. And then it's a very good tip to try and close the reference books altogether and write the fiction. Set yourself free. Set yourself free from the historical record. Set yourself free from your expectations and try and write like a novelist. Try and write completely creatively, completely imaginatively, using the material that you now have internally.
Fantastic advice. Thank you. Thank you. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I just want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for going after the lives of common women, for exploring women's lives. I cannot wait to read that book, to see what it's going to look like. You're on 1850s. You've made some progress. Is the publisher the same? Is it published by Atria as well?
No, this one's going to be published by HarperCollins.
By Harper.
Yep, and it should come out about this time next year.
Great. Well, we can't wait. We will see you back. Hopefully,
My Christmas present next year.
There you go. And hopefully this will not be a virtual conversation. It'll be in person. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Silvia, for
My pleasure. My pleasure.
to everyone watching. And thank you to Anderson's and Northshire Bookshops for your partnership. It's been lovely. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you both so very much. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.